Well, I'm going to back this off slightly because I'm from Brooklyn and I'm pretty loud. And I just want to say, if there's anybody here from Japan Airlines, I will work for business class upgrades. You know, I am not proud. I am perfectly willing. I was actually in Japan about 4 weeks ago. And so, Japan is very much on my mind. And, rather than do what a lot of people do, and we'll see whether this actually works for me because there are more of you than I thought there would be, rather than do like a PowerPoint presentation where everybody's going to be, looking at reading some sentences, I wanted to speak somewhat extemporaneously about sort of, where craft beer has come from kind of around the world. What's gone on over time in Japan, and what we see going on now, and then a couple of fun, exciting things that I've had a chance to to experience. I mean, I think we almost have to start, and it may not be obvious immediately why we have to start with talking about beer in the United States, but it will, in a couple of minutes. And I'll put it this way: I went to school. When I say school, I mean to college, and we drank beer. Here was the thing: we didn't like it. We didn't like it. I mean, it was there, and you drank it. I mean, that was pretty much the thing. We were college students. It was there, you drank it. If you could afford it, you drank it. I have to tell you, we drank Budweiser when we had money, and we almost never had any money. But at least Budweiser actually tasted like water. The other stuff that we could afford tasted much, much worse than water. Some of you may be old enough to remember Mickey's Big Mouth or Hoffenreffer, also known as the Green Death. Not only for the color of the bottle, but the color that you would turn after you had spent an evening with it. Really horrifying stuff. So it wasn't really until I got to England where I arrived expecting a job with HBO in 1983. Then I found that the world of HBO and their business deals did not, in fact, revolve around a 21-year-old and the fact that he was promised a job, and they did not open their division, so I became a stage manager for rock bands. But I also went to the pub and fell in love with this stuff called beer, which I had never actually met before. And it was all different colors and all different flavors, and when you went to the pub, everybody talked about it, like it was the weather, and people didn't refer to themselves as beer fans or beer geeks. It's just like that's what you talked about. Like other people talk about sports, people talked about the beer all the time. And this was a new thing to me. And then I went traveling all around Europe, and I got back a year later, and I went to a bar, and they said, Bud Light, Miller Light, Coors Light. I'm like, oh no, no. So my best friend got me a home brewing kit for Christmas in 1984, and I started brewing at home because he said to me, I'm getting tired of hearing you complain about beer. Why don't you make your own? So I did. And it was a long, slippery slope, but I eventually fell in 1989, and became a professional brewer. I meant to direct. My degree is in broadcasting and film, and I was supposed to, I thought I was going to be a filmmaker. But you hear the story of many people, and you find this in craft brewing all over the world, including Japan. You don't see 18-year-old kids doing it. The beauty of craft beer is really that it grows out of passion, and people always had another life first, and they bring that other life to the life that they have in craft beer. Now, where this comes back around is that really where we start, for beer in Japan is very much, in many ways, both the United States and Germany. For me, when I was growing up, Japan didn't have anything to do with beer. I don't want anybody to take this the wrong way, but I'm 51 years old, and when I was a kid, Japan had largely to do with Gojira. And we were huge, like, monster movie fans. So everything that Toho put out, we saw religiously. And they were magazines. Some of you are maybe old enough to remember that there was a whole rack of magazines that basically covered, these films. We didn't understand the subtext behind them, or the histories, or what was going on. But later, as I became a film student, the work of Kurosawa rose really to the top, and we're talking about the late 70s and early 80s here, of what everybody thought was the best films, that were being made in the world. As I got older, I came to appreciate, Japanese art, and then later, when I was in college, sushi was exceedingly exotic. Not one, you couldn't afford it anyway, and secondly, you knew like 3 people who actually ate it. And now, you're basically talking to people about whether or not a particular stadium or airport, has good sushi. This has happened over time in a way that, like the rest of our food culture, we've barely noticed. It's been a thing that's happened over 30 or 40 years. As Japanese culture, in many ways, has infused its way, into our culture the way so many other cultures have. We have very few words between Japanese and English, which, given the interactions over the years, is really relatively unusual. We have a lot of other words from different languages that have come into English usage, but very few from Japan. So, as some movies have pointed out, most famously Lost in Translation, we don't understand Japan terribly well. And my understanding of Japan, most recently, has come through going there and learning about beer. And recently, I had an interesting interaction. We have a partnership with our friends at the Kyuchi Brewery, who are a sake producer, which in 1994 started to produce beer, and we'll kind of go back around to where that's coming from. But they actually brew Brooklyn Lager in Tokyo. They're the only, rather in Ibaraki, north of Tokyo. They're the only people around the world who brew Brooklyn Lager aside from us here. And so as a thing with a licensing agreement, they were supposed to at some point send us a check for business back and forth. And it's interesting just the misinterpretations. We had not asked them for the money because they're our friends. And we're like, oh, we're not worried about it. It's like you lend your friend $100. You're not thinking about, hey, you better pay me back in 2 weeks. And we found out later that we were like, oh, we're being very casual about that, and they found the fact that we had not asked for it quite worrisome. This must mean that something's wrong with our relationship because you haven't asked for the money. And the Americans thinking, I don't have to ask you for the money because we have a great relationship, And for me, it was just a fascinating illustration, of how these things, can go. Where America comes really into the Japanese beer story is that really, no matter how you look at it, beer, as we understand it, came to Japan, at the pointing of a gun. Japanese beer really does start with the so-called gunboat diplomacy of Matthew Perry. Immediately, Americans started to set up breweries in Japan. And they didn't actually sell very much beer to Japanese. They mostly sold beer to other Americans. And there were huge numbers of them that flooded into the market. They were often kept at as great a distance, from other people as they could be. Sometimes, there were a lot of people doing trading, et cetera. But you had even a few thousand people. In those days, people drank an awful lot of beer. And that could certainly keep people going. You also had a lot of Germans, and you had more and more interaction over the late 1850s and 1860s. So what you start to see, is people setting up breweries in Japan, and most people in Japan themselves were drinking, other stuff, and there was very little interaction socially in that area. And so a man named Johan Thorensen, who moved to the United States, changed his name to William Copeland, which is rather imaginative when you think about it. Johan Thorensen to William Copeland. Okay, that's good. He then moved to Japan, and he opened up a brewery called Spring Valley Brewery in 1870. He went bankrupt in 1884, but only a couple of years later, it had reopened under new ownership, and they started to sell a beer called Kirin. And so this was 1888. In 1874, Sebe Nakagawa went to Germany, and he studied brewing for 2 years. Came back, and in 1876, opened up a brewery which was later sold, and after several names, became Sapporo in 1886. Osaka Brewing was established in 1889, and eventually they were renamed after their best-selling beer, Asahi. So it's kind of interesting to see that by 1890, the 3 top-selling brewers in Japan were already established. You know, this really follows very much the model of what we've seen in the United States. If you think about it, Miller, Budweiser, Coors, all of these had been set up by 1880 and 1890, and they had a lot of interaction back and forth. Now, the Japanese beer culture really started off as a blend. And even though if you look at sake production, I mean, sake is sake, but people often refer to sake as rice wine. If you were to put it more accurately, you would say that it was a different form of beer. Now, a sake producer might say, well, it's not really a different form of beer, it's sake. And that's true. But if you take grain and you convert it into sugar and then you ferment it, you certainly don't get wine. So let's stop this rice wine thing right now. Besides that, you know, a sake producing company is called a brewery, and the person who brews it is called a brewmaster, essentially. So, you know, these are related cultures, and in Japanese brewing, you know, they've become more related recently as people infuse sake techniques and sake culture, you know, into the production of some beers. But as we go back, we see a very German-American focus. There are some breweries that started off with a very Germanic focus and then later shifted to become more American in their beer production. We'll be tasting one of those later this evening, you know, in Orion, which was a more German-style producer until the 1950s in Okinawa. And we, interestingly, never went as far in Japan as the United States did with taking beer down a line to becoming entirely and completely bland. Yes, there were these offshoots, but the levels of bitterness, etc., in Japan were generally kept higher than they were in the United States, and also the level of malt. Now, as many of you probably know, in Japan there are several classes of beer, and there is a beer-like beverage called hapushu, you know, which is generally only about 25% malt. It can be up to 65% by law. If you go below 65%, you become hapushu whether you like it or not. Most of these are relatively cheap drinks. But up until 1994, there were very strict laws in Japan that prevented basically the introduction of what we call microbreweries or craft breweries. So a brewery had to produce at least 15,850 gallons a year, which is not all that much beer, but it's enough to prevent somebody from actually opening a brewery. And we actually still see these types of laws in other places in the world. That went away in Japan. What didn't go away in Japan is a prohibition against homebrewing. So even though there are plenty of homebrewing shops and things like that in Japan, there, technically speaking, aren't supposed to be any homebrewers. And this has had an effect also, you know, on how Japanese craft beer has developed, because it, rather than being mostly a homegrown thing, there's been a big mix between people who were homebrewing technically illegally, and of course we had the same thing in the United States until Jimmy Carter made homebrewing legal here in 1976. You know, many of us, you know, don't realize that homebrewing was completely illegal in the United States until that. So, you know, he may not have been, you know, many people don't think he was the greatest president, but he did all right by me. Everything worked out. So, yeah, I'm just looking here. Yeah, so technically legal to produce in Japan a beverage containing more than 1% alcohol without a license. So that's had an effect, because as you look around other parts of the world, you see a different model. In the United States, home brewers become craft brewers. In Germany, it's often people who have food technology degrees and things like that, and they've taken a different path, and that's actually, I think, very much held back the creativity there. One thing about, I think, overall Japanese culture is a pride and a tendency to craft. And to trying to create something of particularly high quality. And people really appreciate it in a way that in a lot of other cultures, even European cultures, people often don't. So when you're looking at Japanese craft beer, I think it started off even in its early days being on average better than the early days of craft beer that you saw in other countries. And there are a lot of countries where I love the culture and I love the people and we have a good time, but boy, they make some awful beer. They also make some great stuff. But I was thinking of how different the craft beer culture is in Japan than it is, say, in Italy, where there are wonderful beers made, but the whole idea of bella figura takes over the idea of craft. I want to make something fast and beautiful that's going to die young. And that's kind of like what a lot of Japanese, Italian craft brewing is like, where in Japan, someone's going to study for a long time, they're going to be very careful. They might not go as far as somebody else, but they want that stuff to be really, really good. And overall, I've been very impressed. Many people might be surprised to know that Japan is the #4 beer market in the world. A lot of Americans tend to think that we now eat a lot of Japanese-derived food, etc., and we imagine, because many of us also drink sake, and I love sake personally, that's most of what people are drinking in Japan. It isn't. It is mostly beer. So while Japan right now has a relatively small craft beer culture, they really got going pretty early. The beer writer Michael Jackson really helped popularize craft beer in Japan, particularly as he did in the United States, and based partly on his 1984 book, The Great Breweries of Belgium, which was translated into Japanese. By 1984-85, you started to see a lot of Japanese Belgian beer bars, popping up all over the place, and many of us know Popeye, which was a pretty early entrant. I believe they were 1985. But now, today, you will find 40 Belgian beer bars in Tokyo alone, and there are about 70 or 80 throughout the country, and just focusing only on Belgian beers. So that's kind of an interesting thing because you see a particularly large interest in Belgian beers, but you don't yet see so many of the Japanese brewers actually going into Belgian styles. So the fact that this evening you're going to taste a few beers that are in Belgian-derived styles is really kind of exciting and interesting, and I think you're going to see that as part of the next evolution. So as we go back, first of all, Pilsner-style beer, like in the United States, has been the main style of beer that's been produced, obviously, by Japanese breweries. There were one or two others. Interestingly, the German Schwarzbier style, which it means black beer, has continued throughout the whole years, and where that kind of beer died out a long time ago in the United States, we had a wide variety of German-derived beers in the 1800s, but by the 1940s, almost all of them were gone. The Japanese/German black beer style really continued on, and only a couple of years ago, Asahi started to bring into the United States the Kuronama, the Asahi Black, which is a really nice beer, featuring some roasted flavors using roasted malts. And there are a number of beer houses in Japan that actually focus on that beer style. As craft brewers started to open up, they first focused on these German styles, more robust pilsners, driving the adjuncts, meaning corn and rice, etc., out of the beers and trying to follow the German beer purity law, the Reinheitsgebot. Also, the production of Weissbier started up pretty early, and that is the German, for those of you who don't know it, that's the German wheat beer style. And the German-style wheat beer is made generally with about 50% wheat and then fermented with a yeast strain that gives you flavors of bananas and cloves. Importantly, it's actually relatively low in bitterness. So even though the banana, clove, bubblegum sort of character those beers have is unusual to a lot of people, it's also at the same time not shocking and tends to work really well with a wide variety of foods. So, you know, that's kind of a fun thing. Now what you see going on in Japan at the moment is the introduction of a lot of American ideas. Now, for me as an American brewer, I used to go overseas, and, you know, being the American, you go up and you're like, hi, and everybody steps back. I'm an American brewer. And 15 years ago, they'd say, oh, yes, we have heard of your American beer. Open derision, just not even the slightest hint of respect or whatever else. It's like, we are so sorry for your loss. What's fascinating these days is wherever you go in the world, from Japan to Brazil to China, whatever else, the American craft beer style is really, the idiom that everybody's excited about and everybody is working in. Everyone's looking for American hop varieties, which are more pungent and have, technically speaking, have more oil, so they're more aromatic, et cetera. But, what tends to happen, even in the United States, is in a certain way, we got over the American style ourselves a little while ago and started to take on things from Belgium, which we've then also passed around the world. And I'm starting to see that evolution happening in Japan as well. So they've kind of been going through their hop period, their IPA period. And I'm sure that Japanese craft brewers will continue to produce these styles. But I think the next thing that happens, and the most exciting thing, is they start to branch off and create beers that are very distinctly Japanese. And we're starting to see, we've started to see it a while ago back in the early 2000s with what the Kyochi Brewery was doing, but now many other breweries reaching into that as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that. If I don't see, let's see who has the hook that will come out from the side of the stage, just so I can see it coming and speed up when it when it comes along. What's that? Uh-oh. If that's it, I started off with a hook as soon as I got up here. So I've had some great opportunities personally. The first time I went to Japan a few years ago, I did get some time off to run around and particularly fell in love with all the spectacular fish knives that I saw at Tsukiji Market. And I remember I got back and I said, this is the beauty of social media. I said something on Facebook that, there's one place in New York I'm never going to go, and that's Korin Knives. And they said, well, why won't you go there? I was like, because I would drop my entire life savings in less than 15 minutes, because the knives are so beautiful. Within 15 minutes, I had met Saori Kawano from Korean Knives, and she was inviting me to do a cooking demo, with her a few weeks later, which I did, and now we're great pals. So it's funny to see the way these things happen. I've had an opportunity to do some fun things over the years, and one of the most fun ones is that a few years ago, I had the opportunity to bring a Japanese hop back to Japan. And it was a hop that most people in Japan, even brewers, had never heard of. And the hop is called Sorachi Ace. And Sorachi Ace is a hop that was developed by the Sapporo Brewery in the 1970s. And most big breweries will have a hop breeding program. They're trying to find something. In this case, they were trying to find a more pungent version of the Czech Zatz hop, which is very floral and greatly prized. Well, this one in particular didn't work. This particular hop, one plant, the hops came out smelling like lemongrass, lemon verbena, and dill. Not something people were asking for. But they kept it around, like 1 or 2 plants. And then finally, a hop grower in 2000, a hop grower in the United States said, wow, those are fascinating. I'm going to try to start growing those. And eventually, and this is how long it takes, by 2008 they had been released. And I smelled that hop and started to produce, a beer at first on a very small scale as a special called Sriracha Ace, because I was so taken with the aroma of this Japanese hop. A couple of years later, I was going to do some brewing over with Kyuchi in Ibaraki. And we said, okay, we're going to work on some Brooklyn Lager, we're going to do this, but let's make a beer together. And I said, well, the thing that you should definitely make it with is Sriracha Ace. And they were like, what's that? I was like, it's a Japanese hop. And it's like, well, we've never heard of it. Well, it was never actually commercially grown in Japan, though it was developed in Japan. So I actually got on a plane with 11 pounds of Sriracha Ace, and we made a little batch, of this beer called Sriracha Gold, And then when I got home, a couple of months later, I was talking to my hop grower, and he said, the guys from Kyuchi just got 800 pounds of Sriracha Ace. I'm like, oh no. I better make sure, you're going to take care of me, right? I'm going to get my hops this year. They're like, no, you're fine, don't worry. But that's great, and I was actually just over there talking to them about developing, some new collaborative beers that I think are going to be a lot of fun. And any brewers in here, got to be careful. We're working on some stuff, but there's a cool little kumquat-like, lime-like citrus fruit called a sudachi. And the sudachi is sometimes used for making certain types of cold soups, especially for soba noodles, etc. Crops this time of year, and I think I can definitely see some cool things we're gonna be able to do with it. I just have to figure out exactly how to get them into the beer. And that's going to be a fascinating thing. Well, talking to some of the other brewers, it's been fascinating what people have done, because now, as I was saying, you're starting to have a Japanese, idiom of beer. Sometimes this is done by Japanese-born Japanese brewers. Sometimes this will be done by foreigners who have moved to Japan. And so, for example, last year, I think you had Baird here, who I was actually just hanging out with a few weeks back. Making some very cool things that are, his takes on those things. Kyuchi has been doing that for a while, especially the red rice ale, which is pretty well known among craft beer fans, has a very distinctive flavor to it. They made a fascinating beer called 3 Days, which is a sour style of beer, and there are many types of beer in the world that actually are acidic. And actually, this came about, ironically, because of the earthquake. When a few years ago, when the earthquake happened, it actually stopped their production, and the mash got stuck there, in the vessels for 3 days until they were able to move it out. By which time it had soured, and they thought they were going to have to put it down the drain. But it turned into something fascinating, which now they're looking to do, on a regular basis. Years ago, they started making some beers where they would use the techniques for sake production, actually taking the koji, which is an aspergillus mold, growing it on rice, breaking down those starches into sugars, and then blending this with a barley malt mash, and then fermenting with some sake yeast. And that was something where you really start to get a blend, a true blend of sake culture, together with sort of the Western craft beer culture. So later on, we're going to be tasting some fun things. One of my favorite things that I've had a chance to do recently is to make a beer for the famous ramen noodle house, Ippudo. And Ippudo, to me, was a place that, one, made unbelievable ramen, and two, that I could not get into. So, I mean, I tried different times of day. I figured there was a time of day when people were not going to be eating the ramen. So it's like 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon, line down the block. And, beautiful day, 1 p.m. in the afternoon. Everybody's like, as soon as the doors open up, there's a line down the street. And I was comforted when I got to Japan to talk to people and say, well, we love Ippudo. And I thought they would say, oh, yeah, well, Ippudo, whatever. It's like, oh, no, Ippudo is like the best. And Ippudo is actually a chain, and there are about 70 of them in Japan. There are several more around Asia and Southeast Asia. And so when George Ito at Ippudo got in touch and said that he wanted me to make a beer to go with his tonkatsu broth, and ramen, I have to admit that my motivations were not pure. I said to myself, because we get asked every day, and it's very flattering. We get asked every day to make beers for restaurants and restaurant groups all over the world, and we appreciate that. It's very flattering. We almost always say no. We make beer for Thomas Keller at the French Laundry. We make beer for our friends Danny Meyer and those guys in Shake Shack, and we make beer for our friends at 11 Madison Park and Nomad. And that's been it, and we've turned away a lot of people. But when he said, let's go make something for us, I said, I will now be able to get into Ippudo. Awesome. So we went, they showed us how the tonkatsu broth is made, and it's amazing how hard they work. What I first said really is these people are crazy, just like us. They are willing to go all the way. It takes 24 hours to make this broth. And over the years, I've done about 900 dinners in 14 countries. And generally speaking, pairing dinners and things like that, many of them in top restaurants everywhere. What's fascinating for me in trying to achieve this beer is that the idiom of flavors that are working in the broth, that particular broth, they have several, are really not Western flavors. They have a different balance and a different set, and they're not as facile, to approach. The things that are obvious to me after 900 dinners became unobvious. So this has been a fun project, and it's ongoing. Kedama means extra noodles. It's sort of a thing where you have your broth, and they actually take away your noodles that are getting old and soggy and bring you nice, fresh ones. And it's an idea of hospitality, and I think that's wonderful. The beer itself, it has a Belgian base to it, but with some roasted malts. We also infused it with some vanilla, which we get from our friends over at Mass Brothers Chocolate, because they have great vanilla over there. And this came about because when we tasted the broth with some wood-aged beers, which have some vanilla-like flavors to them, we were surprised to see a bridge between the flavors there. But those guys have become good friends, and that is an ongoing thing. What I also love is that when I first gave them the first version of the beer, I was very proud of it. And I talked to them. It's like, what did Kanagai-san think of the beer? Kanagai is their ramen master, and they said, basically, Kanagai says that the beer is beautiful, but you have not yet achieved your goals. And I was like, did he just say no? But that's one reason I think these guys are awesome, because they're just yeah, close. No cigar. We know you're supposedly, really good at what you're doing, but, we have an idea of where you should get. I'm like, okay then, back to the drawing board. And, we're keeping on going. It's going really well. Just as I wrap up here, we're going to taste beers from a few different breweries. Ichigo from Niigata, which started in 1994. Best known here for their stout, but they have some special rice that they're using as well. If you guys, if they've already given you backgrounds of these beers, everybody suddenly reached for some. I hear this rustling. So I'm like, if you already have notes, I don't have to tell you about these. Do they already have notes? Okay. So most of their beers are in German or British styles, but they have some others as well. Ise Kadoya, which opened in Ise in 2000. The 21st generation of this business, which was soy sauce, miso producers, now run this brewery. So when you think about it, that's pretty amazing, 21 generations. And the beers are mostly American style, but they have one called Jeanmai that I think we're having this evening that uses arare, which is a roasted brown rice. Some beer, as I said, from Baird brewers, who are doing really well with 2 tap houses, opening a new brew house soon. So Brian and his wife Sayuri are in charge of that brewery, making a pretty wide range of beers, including some things that are trying to move in a Japanese idiom. Yoho Brewing from Nagano, which opened in 1996, is a subsidiary of Hoshino Resort Company. So they were kind of just getting into it that way. But Toshiyuki Ishii went to Stone Brewery in San Diego, spent 3 years there, and then wanted to reproduce kind of the American idiom, if you like, in Japan. Interestingly, Yoho is called Yaho in Japan. They actually will spell it somewhat differently for us to pronounce it, I guess. So their beer, Yona Yona, which is one of the beers that's here this evening, is, Toshi says is based on Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, but then they've also branched back into doing some things more in a Japanese sort of idiom. And excitingly, Nippon Craft Beer, they're pretty new. They launched a little over a year ago. And the beers that we have here, Kagura Rouge and Kagua White, are very much in sort of Belgian influenced styles, and the Rouge is based on a Flemish brown ale. So that's something that we haven't really seen coming out of Japan yet. Like a few days ago, they won Best Belgian Style Strong Beer at the Hong Kong International Beer Festival. They really are very, very ambitious. 3 partners, young guys, really aiming at the high end of the food market. And of course, Japan is one of the great culinary cultures in the world. So they're really the first brewery to aim very specifically only a couple of beers. The beers are actually being brewed in Belgium, though they intend to bring them back into Japan sometime soon. And then we have Orion, which is a more sort of traditional brewery out of Okinawa. Originally more German, but skewed more in an American direction in the 1950s. So I think that we're gonna see a really nice range here. 2 of the beers, the Sriracha Ace and Kedama, are our beers made here in New York. But the things that we're doing in Japan are ongoing, and we're really excited to see what Japanese brewers are going to do in the future, because you have such a great culinary culture. I think what you're going to see in the future is an infusion of that culinary culture into what's happening in beer, and within a few years you're going to be able to present a range of completely Japanese new ideas in beers, which is going to be awesome.
What do you think about the Italians just coming out with a beer marmalade?
Who came up with the beer marmalade?
Italians in Italy just came out.
Well, I mean, there have been beer marmalades before. People have made all sorts of things out of beers. I saw. I'll make this a very quick story, but it is kind of funny. I was watching a show once on battleships. I was like, I'm watching it, and I'm like, you're a guy, you're sitting there late at night, you're going to watch a show on battleships. Why not? And this one comes on the screen. I'm like, my God, what a beautiful ship that is. And they said the Italian battleship was the fastest battleship, that has ever been produced. And I was like, Jesus, that thing is wonderful. It's like, within 6 months, they were all at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Turned out that the reason why it was so fast was because it had no armor. So one bomb would go straight through the deck and send it to the bottom of the sea. One of the reasons why it was so beautiful, it was white. Sure, it was gorgeous. You could also see it from 35,000 feet and put one bomb through the deck. That kind of gives you the idea of Italian craft beer. They want, no, there are excellent breweries. You know what? But they want bella figura. You want something fast and beautiful. I am not going to learn how to make pale ale first. I'm going to put 12 ingredients into my first brew. But the thing is that it's better to start there, make a bunch of mistakes, and then use your creativity, and when you learn over time to do something, then make the same beers for 100 years, which we did and a lot of other people did, where you have no creativity. So when it comes right down to it, I have a lot of respect for the Italians. If they want to make marmalade out of their beer, go right ahead. The question was, have any new yeast strains originated from Japan? There's a lot of interest in the United States in using traditional sake production yeasts in Japan, in beers. I am unaware of any specific beer yeast that are like Japanese beer yeast, because almost all of those yeasts were actually imported at one point from the United States and Germany. So Japan never had a lager, an ale tradition. They had a lager tradition, because they basically got German brewers at the same time as we got German brewers, 1870s, 1880s, and things were very bad in that part of the world, and Germans fled everywhere. And I mean, you're very surprised when you get down to South America, just like how many, they had the same waves of German immigration that, that we did. And you see in Japan, huge numbers of Germans, in the 1800s. And so, yeah, yes, vice beer production, certainly, but there is no indigenous, beer culture from Japan in our common sense. You had a sake culture, and then you had two different things that are going on, and one is the mold doing what basically the mash does in beer production, basically take you from grain to sugar, and then a yeast strain, which was, is a particular type of yeast to ferment the sugars then into sake. So those sake yeasts, which tend to produce a lot of very fruity flavors, many people have started to experiment with using them, but they are specifically from sake.
I'm not sure the question actually. I just thought of this. But making both beer and wine, fermenting, creating whatever, the wine can often have, the grape will have the yeast of itself.
Right.
You can put the regular yeast in too, but is there a mixing perhaps of the wine yeast that would change the working of a beer?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, but that really depends on what you kind of mean by wine yeast. And, I could talk about this for oh yeah, well, you could talk about this for an hour. Like, we have a whole range of beers we haven't released to the public as part of what we call ghost bottles that I just picked up 2 days ago from the Red Hook Brewery. Natural wine yeast from their fermentations. They do old school, press the grapes, let it ferment by itself, no laboratory yeast. They then give the yeast to us, and we barrel age some beer with those yeasts that completely transform the beer. So, there are a lot of things that are like that. And in Japanese beer production, there is a lot of interest in taking some of the ideas from sake, not just the yeast and things like that, but even the whole idea of, for example, jeonmai and their arare, the roasted brown rice, which comes out of the cuisine, or the polishing of rice, which gives you the grades of sake. So people, are looking for the particular qualities that you get, from different rice strains. I haven't seen much with wine yeast going on in Japan, but I can't doubt that it's coming. Well, I am not going to keep you guys in the part which I know you came for, which is the drinking part. But if you have any further questions, I'll be down there drinking with you. And again, thanks for coming.